I'm continuing today my series on the most underrated science fiction and fantasy of the past decades. Today, we get into the 1980s. How many of these will you recognize? Welcome to Fantasy for the Ages, the show where a father and son talk about fantasy, science fiction, horror, and other nerdy things we enjoy. I'm Jim, the father of this channel. Thanks for being with me today as we get all classic and nostalgic again, looking at the 1980s and some of the best books you've probably never heard of. That's right, in this series, I'm using a formula that helps me determine what were the most underrated, underappreciated, quality science fiction and fantasy books of years gone by. I've already got episodes out on the 60s and the 70s. Today, the 1980s. If you enjoy this, be sure to give us a like, and we hope you'll subscribe to the channel if you're first time here and haven't seen all the stuff we have. Be sure to check it out. You will also see my son Zach on a number of these episodes, but today it's me flying solo. Before I dive right into the 80s here, I have a correction from the 70s. One of our viewers caught that I had a year wrong on one of the underappreciated books. Not that the book wasn't underappreciated, but in all the data I'm looking at, somehow I messed up a number. That would be the book The God Whale, which I put down as one of the most underappreciated books of 1971. Hard to be better appreciated when it hadn't come out until 1974. So, oops, sorry about that gaffe, and thanks for catching me. I will still say The God Whale, that's one to go check out that you probably never heard of. But yeah, it came out in 1974. All right, I have tried to do better with double and triple checking all these pieces of information for the 1980s, and I think I'm accurate on all the years this time around. Let's take a look and see what I've got for you today. In 1980, we've got The Shadow of the Torturer by Gene Wolfe and The Ringwold Engineers by Larry Niven, both very well known. But I've got three very underappreciated books to share. Despite having strong literary merit, they just never caught on like they should have. For the third most underappreciated novel of 1980, I actually had to come in and do a reshoot because it was hard to find the third of these underrated novels. The first pick I had didn't work out. The second pick I had that I recorded had errors. But here I am with the third because I care about quality. And it's Shiva Descending by Gregory Benford and William Rotsler, a collaboration. This is hard science fiction of the first contact style, a thoughtful collaboration exploring contact with alien life, blending serious science with socio-cultural insights. It received a little spotlight compared to Benford's solo works, and no major awards, yet it demonstrates narrative and conceptual depth deserving of reappraisal. Number two is one that I totally knew. And I'm like, what? But the data puts it down as underappreciated. That's The Wounded Land by Stephen R. Donaldson. This is epic fantasy, a psychological fantasy. It's book one of the second Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, which was the second trilogy in the full set of 10 books. Though the Thomas Covenant series was commercially successful, the first trilogy is really what hit home. Its darker second trilogy, beginning with The Wounded Land, never received the same critical respect. Donaldson dives into themes of guilt, ecological destruction, and moral paralysis in a fantasy world suffering deeply from its heroes' past failures. It's psychologically heavy and morally ambiguous, but far more daring than most mainstream fantasy of the era. But number one for this year is Timescape by Gregory Benford. Hard science fiction of a time travel and environmental sci-fi style. Though it won the Nebula, the British Science Fiction Award, and the Campbell Memorial Awards, Timescape is strangely absent from modern science fiction discussions. A deeply scientific and emotional story about researchers trying to warn the past of ecological catastrophe by sending messages through time. Less flashy than many time travel books, but grounded, mature, and eerily prescient. 1981 saw the release of big name titles like The Many Colored Land by Julian May and Little Big by John Crowley, which would go on to win the World Fantasy Award. But here's three that were remarkable contributions, but remain under discussed. Number three is Rhinocerate, also known as Rhinoceros, by Terry Dowling. This is a collection of short stories, science fiction, mythic future, and a part of the Australian new wave of sci-fi, and is part of the Tom Rhinoceros series. Dowling's early rhinoceros stories from the early 80s introduced a futuristic Australia steeped in Aboriginal myth, psychological symbolism, and dream logic. The series, especially in its early form, has been hailed as Australia's dying Earth, but is almost unknown in the United States. The layered cultural world building and literary quality are extraordinary and largely unacknowledged outside Australia. Number two is The Snow Queen by Joan D. Vinge. This is science fantasy of a mythic style, a mythologized epic. And it's book one of the Snow Queen cycle, which I believe is just 2 books. Why is it underrated? It has rich world building, combining futuristic ice world politics with Norse-inspired mythology in a sophisticated psychological story. It explores identity, destiny, power struggles, and the collision of science and ritual. While it won the Hugo Award in 1981, it's often overshadowed by other much more commercially successful sci-fi novels. Its sequel rarely garners the same attention, and the duology remains less reread today. But number one for 1981 is The Warhound and the World's Pain by Michael Moorcock. This is fantasy of theological and historical leanings, and is book one of the Von Beck series. A metaphysical fantasy about a 17th century mercenary hired by Lucifer to find the Holy Grail and end God's suffering. Moorcock blends sword and sorcery with philosophical allegory and theological subversion. Though regarded as one of his most literary efforts, it's rarely discussed compared to Elric or Jerry Cornelius, and has long languished out of print in many regions. 1982 is often remembered for Foundation's Edge by Isaac Asimov, and The Gunslinger, Stephen King kicking off the Dark Tower series, though The Gunslinger was limited in release that year. But several powerful, ambitious, and innovative works from the same year were overlooked by the awards and remain underappreciated. The third most overlooked book of the time is No Enemy But Time by Michael Bishop. This is science fiction of a time travel variety and is a standalone novel. Winner of the Nebula Award, No Enemy But Time follows a modern black man who dreams his way into the Pleistocene era and becomes deeply involved in the lives of early humans. It's a poignant, literary, and unorthodox exploration of identity, ancestry, and longing. Despite the award, it's rarely reprinted, it's under-discussed, and largely forgotten compared to trendier time travel fiction. Number two gives us The Sword of the Lictor by Gene Wolfe. This is science fantasy and a literary epic, and is book three of the Book of the New Sun quartet. While the Book of the New Sun series is now recognized as a classic, Sword of the Lictor is arguably the least discussed of the 4 books, despite being central to Severian's transformation. It deepens the metaphysical themes, expands the strange post-apocalyptic setting, and contains some of Wolfe's most symbolic writing. It also can give you a serious headache. Its brilliance is often overshadowed by the more explosive first and final books. But number one for 1982 is The Unreasoning Mask by Philip Jose Farmer. This is science fiction of a theological space opera style and is a standalone book. A deeply philosophical novel that follows a guilt-ridden star captain navigating a multiverse of religions, gods, and alien minds while being pursued by a cosmic entity. Unlike Farmer's more famous adventure pulp, like Riverworld or World of Tears, this novel is meditative, spiritual, and intimate, exploring sin, sacrifice, and salvation through a sci fi lens. It was too slow and introspective for much commercial success. 1983 brought high profile entries like Star Tide Rising by David Brin, which won the Hugo and the Nebula, and The Mists of Avalon by Marion Zimmer Bradley. But a number of excellent works with great literary merit were overlooked, forgotten, or misunderstood, like number 3 for this year, Kujal's Saga. I'm not sure I'm saying the title right, by Jack Vance. This is a fantasy novel and is book 3 in his Dying Earth series. Kujal's mischievous adventures offer Vance's signature humor and imaginative brilliance. Despite critical praise, including from other authors of the time, for its world and its tone, it didn't receive any major awards and is often overlooked in fantasy retrospectives. Number 2 for 1983 is Tea with the Black Dragon by R.A. McAvoy. This is contemporary and mythic fantasy and is book 1 of the Tea with the Black Dragon duology. A genre blurring novel combining cozy mystery, Taoist philosophy, and modern fantasy. A mysterious Chinese man, possibly a literal dragon in human form, helps a woman find her missing daughter in San Francisco. Nominated for the Nebula, Hugo, and World Fantasy Award, but still relatively unknown outside of dedicated fantasy circles. This is a quiet, thoughtful, and strangely moving novel. But number 1 for 83 is Lioness, also published in some editions as Soldrin's Garden by Jack Vance. Fantasy of the high fantasy style with mythic leanings, this is book 1 of the Lioness trilogy. Though now beloved by Vance aficionados, Lioness was largely ignored by the mainstream fantasy readership of the 1980s, dominated by Tolkien clones, Terry Brooks, and grimdark trends. Vance blends myth, fairy, court intrigue, and dry wit with intricate language and lush world building. Critics later hailed it as one of the greatest fantasy series of the 20th century, but the first volume in particular remains underread. In 1984, high-profile releases like Neuromancer by William Gibson and The Integral Trees by Larry Niven dominated attention. Yet, there are some key 84 titles that I can bring to you that were underappreciated. Number 3 is Job, A Comedy of Justice by Robert A. Heinlein. This is science fiction and a religious satire, and is a standalone novel. The satirical riff on the Book of Job sends its protagonist through parallel realities, religious dogma, and metaphysical absurdity. While it was nominated for both the Hugo and Nebula, many readers found it too bizarre or abrasive. Today, it's one of Heinlein's least read late career works, yet it tackles bold questions about theology, free will, and justice with real nerve. Number 2 is one I was shocked to see the data pull up for me. I even double checked, and there it still was. The Talisman by Stephen King and Peter Straub. This is a dark fantasy novel, and it's part of a multiverse quest. There are 2 books in the Talisman series. A lot of people don't realize that, and then this would be book 1. Though it was a commercial success. I mean, Stephen King's name is attached to it, and Peter Straub was no schmuck. But The Talisman is often overlooked critically due to its YA tone and genre melding weirdness. A dark, sprawling road quest through alternate realities, it influenced later portal fantasies and multiverse fiction. However, it remains critically underexplored and often dismissed as a minor King work, despite deep themes of grief, responsibility, and sacrifice. But number 1 for 1984 is The Glamour by Christopher Priest. A psychological fantasy and a metaphysical thriller, this is a standalone novel. This eerie, cerebral novel centers on a cameraman suffering amnesia after a bombing who may have been involved in something much stranger than terrorism. Priest explores themes of invisibility, obsession, and self erasure in a haunting story that straddles reality and unreality. Though praised by genre critics, it remains obscure and overshadowed by Priest's later The Prestige. 1985 is best known for the publication of Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card and Blood Music by Greg Bear. However, some quieter or more genre defying titles released that year were profound in their insights and literary merits, and here's the three most underappreciated. First, Bridge of Birds by Barry Hugart. This actually came out in 1984, but mass market paperback hit in April of 85, and that's really where people had a chance to discover it. It's a mythic historical fantasy, and it's also a humorous adventure. Book 1 of the Chronicles of Master Li and number 10 Ox. This is a delightful mix of Chinese-inspired myth, detective story, and comedy. Bridge of Birds won the 1985 World Fantasy Award and the 1986 Mythopoeic Award, yet did not gain a lasting place in popular fantasy consciousness. Its genre-smashing tone and cultural depth remain underappreciated. A beautifully written, darkly comic fantasy set in an ancient China that never was. Combining mystery, myth, adventure, and humor, this novel did take those awards home, but it remains one of the genre's best kept secrets. Hugart's unique tone, witty, wise, and weird, sets it apart, and its genre smashing tone and cultural depth remain undervalued. Poor marketing and limited print runs may have kept it criminally underread. Number 2 is one that will shock some of you: The Black Company by Glenn Cook. Dark military fantasy, and this is book 1 of The Black Company, which is quite a series of books. I think there's 10 of them out there now. Now recognized as a precursor to grimdark fantasy, Cook's stripped-down soldier's eye narrative of mercenaries serving a dark empire was revolutionary at the time. But at the time of its release, it received almost no award attention and limited coverage. It influenced Stephen Erickson, Joe Abercrombie, other modern day authors who are very successful and top notch, yet it still lacks the mainstream fantasy readership it deserves. I'd never heard of it before I started Fantasy for the Ages and started talking to many, many, many more readers. Number 1, however, from 1985 is by another well known author, Always Coming Home by Ursula K. Le Guin. This is anthropological science fiction and is a standalone novel set in a far future post-collapse California, and is a standalone novel. An ambitious, genre-blending project combining narrative fiction, poetry, maps, music, myths, and scholarly appendices. This tries to depict the culture of the Kesh people in a far future, eco-conscious California. Though visionary and beloved by scholars, it's rarely read outside of academic or Le Guin devotee circles, partly because it defies conventional storytelling. Le Guin herself described it as her most ambitious work, perhaps too ambitious for most readers. 1986 was the year of Speaker for the Dead by Orson Scott Card and Soldier of the Mist by Gene Wolfe, both award-winning. But here's the 3 least appreciated books of 86 that still had deep themes and considerable literary merit. Number 3 is The Warrior's Apprentice by Lois McMaster Buchhold. This is military science fiction of a space opera style. It's book 2 of her epic for Kosakin saga, and is actually often read as the first entry into that series. While The Warrior's Apprentice launched one of the most beloved space opera sagas ever, introducing Miles for Kosakin, it didn't immediately receive major awards or blockbuster sales at its release. It was like, eh. Compared to later entries like The Vor Game or The Curse of Chalian, early readers sometimes overlooked its ambitious blend of military tactics, character-driven narrative, and compassion. Today, it's recognized among fans, but outside them, it still doesn't get the acknowledgement it deserves as a foundational work in character-rich sci-fi. Number 2 for 86 is The Ragged World by Judith Moffett. This is science fiction of a climate and anthropological sci fi style, and is book one of the Holy Ground trilogy. A deeply thoughtful and literary novel set in a near future devastated by ecological collapse. Moffat, a poet and scholar, brings emotional intelligence and social realism to science fiction. Despite favorable reviews and comparisons to Le Guin, it was largely forgotten after its release and is still absent from major sci fi discussions. Number 1 for 86, though most underappreciated, is Replay by Ken Grimwood. This is a time loop science fiction novel with philosophical leanings and is a standalone novel. This haunting, character driven novel follows a man who dies in his 40s only to wake up back in college, reliving his life again and again. Long before Groundhog Day or the first 15 lives of Harry August, Replay explored the spiritual and existential implications of life repetition. It won the World Fantasy Award, but is still overlooked in modern science fiction and fantasy conversations, despite its profound emotional and thematic resonance. While 1987 brought celebrated releases like The Uplift War by David Brin, which won the Hugo, and Seventh Son by Orson Scott Card, there's still, of course, exceptional works this year that had powerful themes, high ambitions, but didn't get the love. The third most undervalued and underrated would be Unquenchable Fire by Rachel Pollack. This is fantasy of the magical realism style with religious dystopian themes and is a standalone novel. Set in an alternate America where bureaucratic spirituality, divine visions, and ritual magic are normalized, this bold and surreal novel won the Arthur C. Clarke Award, yet has remained obscure. Pollack fuses myth, feminism, and satire in a way reminiscent of Le Guin or Angela Carter. Its visionary intensity and rejection of conventional genre boundaries limited its audience, but its originality is unmatched. Number 2 for 87 is Fortress by David Drake. This is military sci fi and is a standalone novel in the Tom Kelly series. This hard hitting, character driven military sci fi, standalone and separate from his Hammer Slammers or General series, showcases Drake's best balance between strategic realism and emotional depth. Despite strong genre pedigree, it received little attention beyond niche fans and got no major awards. But number 1 is Egypt by John Crowley. This is literary fantasy and historical metafiction, and is book 1 of the 4-book Egypt cycle. An intellectually rich, multi layered novel about hidden histories, alchemy, and parallel truths. It weaves timelines and perspectives with exquisite prose and philosophical complexity. Though widely admired in literary circles, it was too esoteric for many genre readers and largely ignored by major science fiction and fantasy awards. No Hugo nod, no Nebula nod, nothing. Often overshadowed by Crowley's Little Big, it remains one of the most challenging and rewarding modern fantasy novels. While 1988 featured prominent releases like Cytine by C.J. Cherry, which won the Hugo and Locus, and Red Prophet by Orson Scott Card, other works from the same year delivered exceptional quality and deep thematic content, yet remain underread or underappreciated in broader genre discourse. Number 3 would be Wizard of the Pigeons by Megan Lindholm, also known as Robin Hobb. This is urban fantasy of a contemporary mythic style and is a standalone novel. Set in the modern streets of Seattle, this subtle urban fantasy blends magic with gritty realism. It came recommended in Fantasy and Science Fiction magazine in April of 1988, but quickly faded from the spotlight. It's beloved for its emotional resonance and mystery, yet rarely appears on fantasy must-read lists. Quiet sophistication, strong emotional impact, but virtually no marketing and no awards attention. Number 2 for 88 is Neverness by David Zindel. This is a philosophical sci-fi novel of a space opera style and is book 1 of a Requiem for Homo Sapiens series. This intellectually ambitious space opera combines mathematics, mysticism, genetic manipulation, and mythic storytelling. Zindel's writing recalls both Frank Herbert and Gene Wolfe in tone, dense, elusive, and metaphysical. While it gained a devoted following in the United Kingdom, it was never widely embraced in the US, and it remains one of the least known grand philosophical epics of modern sci fi. But number 1 for 88 is Fool on the Hill by Matt Ruff. This is fantasy of the urban myth style, a campus fairy tale type. It's a standalone novel, a wildly imaginative novel set on a magically tinged Cornell University campus. Fool on the Hill features talking animals, Norse gods, literary sprites, and a metafictional author caught in the tale. A cult favorite, it was critically praised on release but never caught on with mass audiences. Ruff's later fame, Lovecraft Country, has revived some interest, but this debut still flies below the radar. While 1989 brought big names like Hyperion by Dan Simmons, the Hugo winner, and Prentice Alvin by Orson Scott Card, several lesser known or long overlooked titles demand your attention. And let me share the 3 most underrated. Number 3 is In the Drift by Michael Swanwick. This is an alternate history, post-apocalyptic sci-fi, and also fits under the weird sci-fi classification. It's a standalone novel. Set in a mutated, alternate America where the 3 Mile Island disaster triggered full nuclear meltdown, this early Swanwick novel combines gritty survivalism with mythic weirdness. Preceding his more experimental work, Stations on the Tide, it's an ambitious debut that remains off the radar even among Swanwick fans. Number 2 for 89 is Red Spider White Web by Misha Noga. This is cyberpunk, feminist sci-fi, and also the biopunk style. It's a standalone novel. This indigenous feminist cyberpunk novel, that is not a phrase I've ever said before, follows a native artist in a grim, genetically engineered near-future America. Blending biopunk, body humor, and multimedia expression, Red Spider White Web is often compared to Neuromancer, but with more experimental and culturally charged storytelling. It was virtually ignored by the mainstream press and remains obscure despite its originality and power. But number 1, the last book of the 80s I'm sharing is The Boat of a Million Years by Powell Anderson. Science fiction with immortality and historical leanings. It's a standalone novel, and I'm guilty on this one. This is another book I had sitting on my shelf for many years. It came in a book club, and I was never interested enough to open it before getting rid of it, turning it into a used bookstore. Spanning millennia, this novel follows a group of immortals through ancient civilizations and into the far future, confronting loneliness, progress, and meaning. A deeply philosophical and humanistic work from Anderson's later period. It was nominated for the Nebula, but never attained the legacy status of his more action-driven early sci-fi. It remains one of the most thoughtful meditations on time and humanity in the genre. And again, I let it slip away. Well, those are my 1980s novels, all underappreciated quality works of fiction. Have you read any of them? Do you have thoughts? Put it down in the comment box. I love seeing what you share, and I do respond. You know it. Also, down in the comment box, share anything you want to say about the 80s. Other books that you feel are underappreciated, you want to give them some love, put them down there. Below, find the show notes where you can also interact with Zach and I in a number of other ways. Links to our Discord, our social medias, even our Patreon page are all included there. Thank you to those of you who support us regularly on Patreon each month, and we invite any of you, if you're liking the content, you want to see it keep coming, consider becoming a Patreon supporter. And just $1 a month helps us keep this going. Thanks for watching. We'll talk to you next time.